Hi everybody, I wanted to make a video about how to read philosophy texts as well as classical literary texts. I often have students say in feedback and things that they're not good readers because they have to read things 2 or 3 times in order to understand them. And that's absolutely not the case in philosophy. I had a professor from Belgium in my PhD program who told me once, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, that's a good book to read 11 times. After 9 times, you start to understand it. And he was exactly right. So in philosophy, we have to read things multiple times, and we have to read things slowly. This is not Harry Potter. This is not 50 Shades of whatever. This is philosophy. It's very dense. It's very difficult. And so going into this, you need to psychologically prepare yourself and say, I need to read this multiple times in order to understand it. Good reading takes a lot of focus as well. So what you need to do is try to get yourself into a quiet space. I recommend, if you need music or sound, I recommend using non-verbal music. So for example, classical music or ambient music or like electronic music. Taiko's pretty good. It's Aphex Twin. Some of those, you know, are really good actually. I like those to read to and to study to. But I just thought I would do like a little read aloud here. And this is Du Bois's Of the Sons of Master and Man. So this is a literary work. The first thing when you're reading something is it's a good idea to figure out who the author is. So this is W.E.B. Du Bois. And Wikipedia is acceptable in this instance. You can just go to Wikipedia and look up the history of these people and of the authors to get an idea of who they are and when they were writing and things of that nature. Now, this piece is called Of the Sons of Master and Man. It comes from his book, The Souls of Black Folk, which is a series of essays that he wrote post Civil War. So America is kind of moving into the 20th century, or into the 1900s, from mid to late 1800s, the Civil War and slavery. W.E.B. Du Bois was a black man, and he was the first person to ever receive a PhD from, I believe, Harvard. I could be wrong on that one. The first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard. And interestingly enough, he initially was a school teacher for black students in Tennessee following his studies, or perhaps maybe before he pursued his PhD, but after his bachelor's degree. Because again, at that time, even though the Civil War was over, African Americans taught black children and white people taught white children, and there was still that severe separation. And The Souls of Black Folk, the essays are all about the divide between basically between black and white in the United States, but that can easily be translated to different minority groups that exist today. And that's why we're reading this piece, because it talks about the prejudices and preconceptions that were part of this society and the way that people thought about things. Sorry, I'm going to close this window just so that the sun is ruining. Well, I'm thankful to have the sun since I'm in San Diego. It's kind of nice. I mean, it's mid-February and it's about 65 degrees outside. Went for a surf yesterday. That sure beats Chicago, 2 degrees. The polar vortex, as you might all know it as. And for those of you in the South, you're getting a little taste of some winter weather, so enjoy it. Okay, so I'm just going to start reading. So this starts with a little poem by someone, Mrs. Browning. Life treads on life and heart on heart. We press too close in church and mart to keep a dream or grave apart. Now you might have no clue what that person is talking about or why Du Bois is using this as an intro to this essay. But after you read the essay, you might come back to this and understand that we press too close in church and mart. So, and I'm going to say white and black here just because it's easier. And actually, if I say anything, because Du Bois is writing during a time where certain words were acceptable to use. So please do not hold, that's the age in which he was writing. So anyway, we press too close in church and mart to keep a dream or grave apart. So whites and blacks in this society are pressing close together in church and in the marketplace, right? Or in relation to religion in the marketplace. But they're kept apart. Their graves are kept apart, literally. Their dreams are kept apart. But this person is arguing that the physical proximity of those two groups necessarily means that their graves and their dreams should not be kept apart, but should come together in unity. And now Du Bois begins. And you can see I'm already analyzing everything, right? Again, you cannot read philosophy and great literature without slowing down. You know, Nietzsche said that one thing is required to become a great reader, and that's rumination. He said we have to become like a cow. How does a cow eat? It ruminates, right? It chews and chews and chews. And if you've ever been on a farm and you've seen cows chewing their cud, you know that saliva is like coming down, right? Their lips, and they just stand there all day. And then the cow swallows down the portion that they've been chewing, and it goes into the stomach. But what does the cow do? The cow then brings up that portion and again chews it, so literally regurgitates it from the stomach, and then it travels through a series of stomachs, a series of regurgitations, and then the cow keeps chewing and chewing and chewing, and then finally the meal goes down into its belly and it's able to digest it, and then the meal becomes part of its body. And that's exactly what Nietzsche says that we need to do when we read. We need to read over and over and over again, vomiting up things that we don't understand until we can chew them enough that we can keep them in our stomachs, and then those things will contribute to our overall being. They'll keep us alive, right? Both in a literal as well as a metaphorical sense. So here's Du Bois. The world-old phenomenon of the contact of diverse races of men is to have new exemplification during the new century, the 20th century. So the contact of diverse races, and here Du Bois kind of lumps race in with ethnicity, so he's talking about different people groups as well as different colors of people. Okay. Indeed, the characteristic of our age is the contact of European civilization with the world's undeveloped peoples. Whatever we may say of the results of such contact in the past, it certainly forms a chapter in human action not pleasant to look back upon. So here, Du Bois is saying that when European civilization comes into contact with undeveloped people, so what many of you might think of, you know, like Columbus coming to the United States, or at that time America, and finding this group of what he called heathens, native indigenous people. Du Bois is talking about that here, and he says that whatever the results of that in the past, it certainly is not something good to look at. War, murder, slavery, extermination, and debauchery. This has again and again been the result of carrying civilization and the blessed gospel to the isles of the sea and the heathen without the law. So if there are any words, as you're reading, if there are any words that you don't understand, you need to look them up. Don't rely on intuition or yourself. It's very simple now with the internet to type in a word and you have the definition. So debauchery, you might not know that word. Look it up. Debauchery is actions that are considered outside of ethical norms. So sex, drugs, rock and roll, violence, orgies, all those things would be considered debauchery. And what Du Bois is saying here is that war, murder, slavery, extermination has always been the result of taking civilization and the blessed gospel to the isles of the sea and the heathen. So what is the blessed gospel? Can you think of what that might be? It's the Bible. So taking Christianity and civilization to quote-unquote uncivilized people has caused all these things that Du Bois lists here. Nor does it altogether satisfy the conscience of the modern world to be told complacently that all this has been right and proper. The fated triumph of strength over weakness, of righteousness over evil, of superiors over inferiors. It would certainly be soothing if one could readily believe all this, and yet there are too many ugly facts for everything to be thus explained away, or easily explained away. Okay, again, the language is different, right? He's writing in a different form of prose, but the meaning, we need to tease out the meaning here. So he says it doesn't satisfy us to be told that the reason why it was right and proper for people to promote Christianity and civilization across the world is because it was merely strong people overcoming the weak, right? And we see this regularly, and some people still believe this, that that there were all these crazy heathens, right? These like godless people who were naked, right? And running around and doing crazy things like sharing and not believing in private property. But anyway, there were all these crazy people, and then we've actually, because we were stronger, we were able to, that's what made it right. Because we were strong and we brought them civilization, it was right, it was okay to decimate these people or to exploit them or to use them. For example, Columbus himself guaranteed the king that he could send back as many slaves as possible from the Americas because it would be really easy to trap these people. And he said things like, they give you gold and stuff, just when you ask them, they'll give you gold, so I'll just keep asking them and I'll keep sending gold back and slaves, so we're good for now. I mean, the whole point of this discovery ended up becoming this trade between the Americas and Europe back and forth. On a side note, again, as you're reading these things, it's important to think about your own life. When you look at what happened to people's societies when quote-unquote civilization came, you often see the decimation of people groups, as well as people who are not very happy. That civilization itself doesn't bring happiness. That perhaps the earlier lifestyle was better in some sense. Now, there's the opposite tendency to say kind of promote this alternative or the primordial indigenous lifestyle as being great. But I think most people would say, you know, it's really nice that we, in our country at least, have methods for preventing children from dying when they have diarrhea, and things like that. But at the same time, there are other really bad things that happen when, you know, this kind of consumer society, this capitalist society comes into play. People start caring more about money and possessions than they do about the development of their character or perhaps their social relationships. And that's not always the case, but I think all of us, if we think about it, we experience a lot of stress based on our capitalistic society, thinking about, oh, I need to get a job, oh, I don't have a job, oh, my job doesn't have benefits, what am I going to do, I need money, all of these things. It causes a lot of stress. Okay. We feel and know that there are many delicate differences in race psychology, numberless changes that our crude social measurements are not yet able to follow minutely, which explain much of history and social development. At the same time, too, we know that these considerations have never adequately explained or excused the triumph of brute force and cunning over weakness and innocence. Now, here, Du Bois is betraying the fact that he believes that there is a difference in race psychology, that people of different races and ethnic groups have different modes of thought. Now, that's a very debatable issue, and many people would disagree with that claim now. But at the time, it was just considered to be true. But he said that even if there are differences in race psychology, even if some groups of people think in a more quote-unquote simplistic manner than other groups, that doesn't adequately provide justification for brute force and destruction of that group. Now, Hume says the same thing. I forget in which book it is, but he says, suppose that there were a group of creatures on Earth that were much like humans, but very tiny and very weak, and there was no way that any of them could do anything against you. He said it wouldn't be right just to enslave them or destroy them just because they're small and weak. In fact, Hume says it's the responsibility of the stronger to ensure the safety of that weaker group. And I think many of us have that same intuition. For example, excuse me, in thinking about people who have Down syndrome or are mentally disabled in some way or physically disabled in some way, many of us believe that it's important that other people who have their full mental capacity or their full physical capacity act for the liberation and the empowerment of those groups. That most of us would find it revolting to think about enslaving a bunch of children who had Down syndrome merely because they didn't have the same rational faculties that many of us do. And that's what Du Bois is saying here. And now I'm not saying that different races, you know, have different rational faculties, but that's the point he's making. All right, I'm not going to go on too much longer, but I want to take it a bit further. It is then the strife of all honorable men of the 20th century to see that in the future competition of races, the survival of the fittest shall mean the triumph of the good, the beautiful, and the true, that we may be able to preserve for future civilization all that is really fine and noble and strong, and not continue to put a premium on greed and impudence and cruelty. So again, here we need to think about what it was like in the South post-Civil War. In the initial, it's like, okay, here's slavery. Slavery is totally acceptable. That human being is your property merely because of the color of his or her skin. And then literally in the matter of a day, this institution is no longer legal. Everyone is free. Now, think about what it would be like to live in that society where a law is passed, but still all of the institutions still exist there. This group is still reliant on the dominant group precisely because they have been for years and years and years. To bring this hope to fruition, meaning the hope of beauty and strength being translated to future generations, we are compelled daily to turn more and more to a conscientious study of the phenomena of race contact. So here's where Du Bois starts talking about what he wants to do in this essay. He wants to talk about the contact between the races. Again, here he's primarily talking about the contacts of blacks and whites in the South. To a study frank and fair and not falsified and colored by our wishes or our fears. And we have in the South as fine a field for such a study as the world affords. A field, to be sure, which the average American scientist deems somewhat beneath his dignity, and which the average man who is not a scientist knows all about. But nevertheless, a line of study which by reason of the enormous race complications with which God seems about to punish this nation, must increasingly claim our sober attention, study, and thought. We must ask, what are the actual relations of whites and blacks in the South? And we must be answered not by apology or fault-finding, but by a plain, unvarnished tale. In the civilized life of today, the contact of men and their relations to each other fall in a few main lines of action and communication. So where do the races interact literally in society? There is first the physical proximity of home and dwelling places. Okay, whites and blacks have homes and dwelling places that are close to each other. The way in which neighborhoods group themselves and the contiguity of neighborhoods, so the structure of the neighborhood itself. And many of you might live in current society, cities or maybe rural communities that literally have a separation of minority and majority groups, so whites and black groups or whites and Latinos. And we all know this, right? There's like a Latino area of the city, a black area of the city, a white area of the city. And of course there are some minor interactions, but for example in Chicago, there's a clear demarcation between majority and minority groups in that city, and we have the same. Things are changing and things are becoming more diversified. But you can think of it, right? Like in your own hometown, does a railroad track separate a certain group from another group? Does the main street separate a certain group from another group? Does a river? It could be anything. Okay. Secondly, and in our age chiefest, there are the economic relations. So first we have the dwelling places. The second is the economic relations. So the methods by which individuals cooperate for earning a living, for the mutual satisfaction of wants, for the production of wealth. Next, third, there are political relations. So humans engage in political relations in relation to ethnic groups. That's where people come into contact as well. In the fourth place, there are the less tangible but highly important forms of intellectual contact and commerce, the interchange of ideas through conversation and conference, through periodicals and libraries, and above all, the gradual formation for each community of that curious tertium quid, which we call public opinion. All right, so intellectual contact and commerce. How do whites and blacks in the South, leading into the 20th century, interact with each other intellectually as they're walking around, perhaps in terms of lectures, education, and things like that. And I'll stop soon. Closely allied with this come the various forms of social contact in everyday life. So people come into contact in travel, in theaters, in house gatherings, in marrying and giving in marriage. And we all know the marriage between different minority or different ethnic groups has been a huge issue in our society, and still is an issue, although again in many places that's changing. Okay, all right, so at the end of this chapter, or at the end of this paragraph, Du Bois says, "It is my present task, therefore, to indicate from my point of view how the black race in the South meet and mingle with the whites in these matters of everyday life." So what Du Bois is going to do is he's going to talk about how whites and blacks interact in this society. But he's also going to point out the disparities between white and black ethnic groups. And he's also going to talk about what a unified society would look like, what a more just society would look like in terms of education, in terms of economic possibilities, in terms of the political process. And so the rest of this essay is his analysis of the ways that people interact with each other, and also his ideas about how the South can move from slavery and apartheid to a more just form of life in which the races come together rather than separate according to color lines, according to prejudice, and according to all these false ideals that kind of govern this society. Okay, so anyway, that's a little bit about how to read philosophy, and I kind of took you through everything that I was thinking and did a little interpretation of some of the more difficult language here. And I hope that that helps. And again, read slowly, ruminate, become a cow when you read philosophy. When you read things multiple times in order to understand them, that doesn't mean that you are a poor reader. That means that you are an excellent reader. And read in a place that's free from distractions. Don't have the TV on when you're trying to read this stuff. And don't read it like you would a novel. You can't. You can literally physically do that, but you will not get anything out of it because so much of the density and the depth and the beauty of the writing will be lost in the rush to complete the task. So I hope that helps, and I hope you enjoy the essays in this course.